Mental illness, a glossary, ambivalence, mixed feelings, compulsion, persistent self-administered command, delusion, belief said to be false by persons who do not share it, elation, self-exaltation and self-glorification, insanity, insubordination to civilian authority, multiple personality, the many false faces of the person who does not show his one true face, narcissism, obsession, persistent self-administered idea, especially doubt or certainty, psychosis, malignant seriousness manifested by inability to laugh at oneself, mental illness as caricature, depression, contrition, conceit, hypochondriasis, concern for being healthy, decisiveness, obsession compulsion, conscientiousness, paranoia, concern for danger and protection, schizophrenia, indolence, mental illness as drama, depression tragedy, hysteria, comedy, paranoia parody, farce. Typically, bodily illness is something the patient has, whereas mental illness is something he is or does. Bodily illness is in the patient's body, mental illness is in his record. A person is said to get a cold, or come down with the flu, or develop cancer, but he goes mad. The verb go again suggests that madness is a doing, not a happening. Delusion of grandeur, inflating one's self-esteem by self-created fictions, existential masturbation. Delusion of worthlessness, the same as above, attributing cosmic significance to one's petty sinfulness. In each case, real existential impotency is replaced by fake existential superpotency. The person suffering from brain disease, say Alzheimer's dementia, is like a fine building, once a comfortable home for families, falling into disrepair and becoming an empty shell, no longer fit for human habitation, whereas the person suffering from mental disease, say schizophrenia, especially if he is an adolescent or young adult, is like an empty lot for which a fine building was planned but never built. Commitment laws invariably refer to the mental patient's dangerousness to himself and/or others, illustrating that, ontologically, mental illness is something the person does to himself or others. This is why, if he wants to, a person can stop being mentally ill, and if he does not want to, no one can stop him from being mentally ill. In the 1970s, in a dramatic show of pseudo-liberal largesse, psychiatrists gave their patients a right to refuse treatment. It seems, however, that the effort to exercise that right is itself a mental illness requiring treatment. A conference at McGill University in Montreal in 1987 was entitled Psychiatrists' Responsibility to Treat the Patient's Right to Refuse. Clearly, the Western idea of individual right is just as foreign to Western psychiatrists as it is to, say, Middle Eastern religious fanatics. Virtually every bodily illness a person can have, a cadaver can have also. A cadaver may thus be said to have cancer, pneumonia, or myocardial infarction. But surely, a cadaver cannot have a mental illness. Nevertheless, it is the official position of the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and other medical and psychiatric groups that mental illness is like any other illness. According to contemporary scientific psychiatry, there are two kinds of mental disease: those whose neuropathological character has already been demonstrated to the satisfaction of pathologists, and those whose neuropathological character has not yet been so demonstrated. The former, called neurological diseases, are treated by neurologists. The latter, called psychiatric diseases, are treated by psychiatrists. Because this view now constitutes both scientific dogma and popular belief, the possibility that some psychiatric diseases are not diseases, but are only so called, is, a priori, ruled out of court. Would-be medical patients are cautioned about medical treatments with the old adage that the cure may be worse than the disease. Would-be psychiatric patients should be cautioned about psychiatric treatments with a new adage, namely, that there are no psychiatric diseases except those caused by psychiatric diagnoses and cures. Madness, said Wittgenstein, need not be regarded as an illness. Why shouldn't it be seen as sudden more or less change of character? Why not, indeed? Because we want to treat madness as an illness. It is as simple as that. Psychiatrists say that the homosexual who doesn't like being a homosexual suffers from an illness called ego-dystonic homosexuality. But psychiatrists do not say the Jew who doesn't like being Jewish suffers from an illness called ego-dystonic Judaism, or that the woman who doesn't like being a woman suffers from an illness called ego-dystonic femininity, or that the poor person who doesn't like being poor suffers from an illness called ego-dystonic poverty. Ostensibly, the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a list of mental diseases. Actually, it is a list of the profession's claims to categories of conduct. As prospectors stake out claims for mines which they suspect harbor precious minerals, so psychiatrists stake out claims for madmen who they suspect harbor precious maladies. However, although minerals cannot own mines, madmen being persons can own madness. Thus, the only remedy for psychiatric imperialism is to restore madness to its rightful owner, the madman, and to give the psychiatrist access to it only on terms agreeable to the proprietor. When a person fails to follow normal rules of conduct, that is, the rules most people follow, we say he is mentally ill, and when he does not respond to conventional rewards and punishments as we want him to respond, we say he is seriously mentally ill. It is true, of course, that one cannot treat many mentally ill persons normally, but it is equally true that one cannot treat children, foreigners, the very old, the disabled, or the religious fanatic normally either. The reason is simply that insofar as people live by different rules, have different expectations, respond to different rewards and punishments, they will consider each other immature, strange, bizarre, or crazy, and difficult or impossible to live with. What people now call mental illness, especially in a legal context, is not a fact but a strategy, not a condition but a policy, not a disease the alleged patient has, but a decision which those who call him mentally ill make about how to act toward him. Psychiatric diagnoses are stigmatizing labels phrased to resemble medical diagnoses, applied to persons whose behavior annoys or offends others. Those who suffer from and complain of their own behavior are usually classified as neurotic. Those whose behavior makes others suffer, and about whom others complain, are usually classified as psychotic. Illness, mental illness, race, religion, occupation, each is, inter alia, a personal characteristic or role that may be assumed by a person or attributed to him. One of the features that distinguishes mental illness from medical illness, schizophrenia from diabetes, is that mental illness defines the person, whereas medical illness does not. This is why we read about schizophrenic murderers, but not about diabetic murderers. A woman kills her 9-month-old son because, she says, she believes that the baby is the devil. If I kill the demon, my husband will raise the baby to life again in 3 days, and the world will know he is Jesus Christ. Charged with first-degree murder, the mother is acquitted as not guilty by reason of insanity. She sues her obstetrician and the psychiatrist she had seen while she was pregnant. Psychiatrists say she was suffering from postpartum psychosis. I say she is colossally conceited. What the psychiatrist calls a delusion of persecution is one of the most dramatic human defenses against the feeling of personal insignificance and worthlessness. In fact, no one cares a hoot about Jones. He is an extra on the stage of life, but he wants to be a star. He cannot become one by making a fortune on the stock market or winning a Nobel Prize. So he claims that the FBI or the communists are watching his every move, are tapping his phone, and so forth. Why would they be doing this unless Jones were a very important person? In short, the paranoid delusion is a problem to the patient's family, employers, and friends. To the patient, it is a solution to the problem of the meaninglessness of his life. The proverb admonishes not to curse the darkness, but to light a candle. This seemingly good advice overlooks the advantages of cursing the darkness and not lighting a candle, namely, the benefit that comes from seeing oneself as a virtuous victim and the justification for avoiding the consequences of vision. Thus are the patient's solutions the psychiatrist's problems. For the mental patient's family and society, mental illness is a problem. For the patient himself, it is a solution. This was Freud's only discovery. Psychoanalysts now ignore it, and psychiatrists deny it. The most basic human need is for relationship with other human beings. This need has been met primarily by and within the family, or clan, stabilized by religion and tradition. As conventional family ties have loosened and persons have become individuals, family relationships, as a source of human contact, have been replaced in large part by what we now call chronic mental illness. We see, and conventionally are only supposed to see, the disutility of mental illness. Its utility, because of our unquestioned belief in the value of individualism, lies in binding together family members no longer bound by parental, marital, or filial ties. Doubt is to certainty as neurosis is to psychosis. The neurotic is in doubt and has fears about persons and things. The psychotic has convictions and makes claims about them. In short, the neurotic has problems, the psychotic has solutions. If a man lies about his car so he that can get more money for it, that is rational economic behavior. If he lies about himself so that he can get more attention, that is irrational madness. We respond to the former by bargaining about the price, to the latter by treating mental illness. When a person does something dramatically bad like shooting the president, it is immediately assumed that he might be mad, madness being thought of as a disease that might somehow explain why he did it. When a person does something dramatically good, like discovering how to prevent or cure a hitherto incurable disease, no similar assumption is made. I submit that no further evidence is needed to show that mental illness is not the name of a biological condition whose nature awaits to be elucidated, but the name of a concept whose purpose is to obscure the obvious. The search for the neuropathological correlates of mental illnesses is based on a fundamental misconception, namely, on viewing complex social performances as if they were simple reflex movements, like a grand mal seizure. We use terms such as schizophrenia, manic depression, and psychosis to identify enduring patterns of human behavior that so-called patients exhibit and which the patients, or more typically, their families and psychiatrists, find troubling and undesirable. Accordingly, psychopathological terms do not resemble neuropathological terms such as grand mal seizure or locomotor ataxia, but instead resemble evaluative terms such as great statesman or sadistic criminal. Whether a person is a statesman or a criminal depends partly on what he does and partly on our judgment of it as virtuous or wicked. Since the very phenomenon for which we seek a neuropathological correlate is an opinion like whether a particular work of art is beautiful or not, it is prima facie absurd to look for its neuropathological correlate. For what is the it supposedly caused by a brain dysfunction? The proposition that mental illness is not a medical but a moral condition or idea is evident from the fact that we sever the mad criminal from his crime, but do not sever the mad artist from his art. We discredit the mad criminal as lacking criminal intent and do not blame him for his criminal acts, but credit the mad artist with artistic intent and praise him for his artistic acts. An Arkansas appeals court recently ruled that bipolar disorder is a physical, not mental, illness. Comments: Paul Fink, MD, President-elect of the American Psychiatric Association. The Arkansas case gives psychiatrists an extraordinary window of opportunity. It is deeply revealing of the nature of psychiatry that psychiatrists look to the law, not science, to validate them as scientists, to judges, not patients, to validate them as healers. Plus change. Inquisitors look to the church to legitimize their fantasies as facts, and to the prince to validate the torturing of bodies as the saving of souls. Sartre says that hysteria is a lie without a liar. One could also say that the hysteric is a liar who does not admit or recognize his lies. As persons, we are both agents and storehouses of memories. Our abilities as agents may be impaired by bodily injuries, illnesses, infirmities, and/or by legal and political restraints. Similarly, our capacities as stores of memories may be impaired by bodily injuries, illnesses, infirmities, and/or by assaults on and ablations of our brains, the physical basis of our memories. Sometimes, such assaults come from without, for example, from head injury or lobotomy. More often, they originate in the self and society from a meeting of personal cowardliness with psychiatric coercion. Freud said the hysteric suffers from reminiscences. Not so. The hysteric suffers from his inability or unwillingness to come to terms with his traumatic memories. The psychiatrist legitimizes this evasion, transforming it into an illness and a mystery which only he can unravel. Similarly, the psychotic may be said to suffer from reminiscences. But again, it would be more accurate to say that he suffers from his inability or unwillingness to come to terms with his guilty memories, exemplified by Lady Macbeth. The psychiatrist legitimizes this evasion even more enthusiastically, transforming it into a serious illness and a mysterious biological genetic defect which only he can research. In short, mental illness is typically the result of a collusion between the individual, qua mental patient, and the psychiatrist, qua medical mystery worker, transforming the patient from a person qua agent filled with memories into a body qua receptacle filled with lesions. Patient and psychiatrist transform the bad memories into bad lesions and emerge with bad lives. The patient because he is deprived of integrity, the psychiatrist because his job is to help people to deprive themselves and others of integrity. The paranoid is a person who insists you don't like him when in fact you don't, but when the polite thing for him to do would be to keep quiet about it. Among persons categorized as mentally ill, there are two radically different types. One is composed of inadequate, unskilled, lazy, or stupid persons. The other of protesters, revolutionaries, those on strike against their relatives or society. Because psychiatrists do not differentiate between the unfit and the unwilling, they often attribute unfitness to unwillingness and unwillingness to unfitness. If a person doesn't listen to his inner voice when young, he may before long find himself hearing voices which hell think come from without. Tyranny is forcing people politically to be unfree. Insanity is forcing people psychologically to treat one as if he were unfree. The tyrant uses brute force to gain his way. The psychotic, the brutal drama of madness. The tyrant plays shepherd, forcing people to be sheep. The psychotic plays lost sheep, forcing people to be his shepherd. Everything, a landscape, a flower, a work of art, is a creation either of nature or of man. Each may or may not be said to be beautiful. The beauty or ugliness of each is an attribution. Similarly, every person exhibits some sort of behavior, and every behavior or person may or may not be said to be mentally ill. The mental health or mental illness of each is an attribution. It may be a self-attribution, the person regarding himself as mentally ill, or it may be an attribution made by someone else, the person being defined as mentally ill by others. The attribution of mental illness is both an accusation and an excuse. Which of these elements predominates in any particular situation depends on the context and its consequences. It cannot be inferred from the semantic use of the phrase mental illness. This is why psychiatric and other accounts of persons characterized as mentally ill that omit any reference to who the person is, how and why he came to be so diagnosed, and what happened to him as a consequence, are virtually meaningless. They are merely reaffirmations of the claim that mental illness qua illness is not a fiction, but a fact. Two great Englishmen have articulated, perhaps better than anyone could hope, the subject we now call mental illness. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes wrote, "The passion, whose violence or continuance maketh madness, is either great vainglory, which is commonly called pride, and self-conceit, or great dejection of mind. In sum, all passions that produce strange and unusual behavior are called by the general name of madness." In 1882, Samuel Butler wrote, "All our lives long, every day and every hour, we are engaged in the process of accommodating our changed and unchanged selves to changed and unchanged surroundings. Living, in fact, is nothing else than this process of accommodation. When we fail in it a little, we are stupid. When we fail flagrantly, we are mad. When we suspend it temporarily, we sleep. When we give up the attempt altogether, we die."